When it came to this series of mine and discussing scenes that I find either essential or influential in some way, I was anticipating getting to talk about Sayaka. It should be apparent now that she is one of my favorite characters in the series, and quite easily one of my favorite characters in fiction overall. So of course, when I conceptualized this series, I knew exactly what scene would be used for my inevitable essay on her. Sayaka is an underappreciated character in this series, and when I think of that, it's hard for me to realize why. But truthfully, despite being the main focus of the middle of the series, Sayaka doesn't often get the spotlight unless it's to show her thoughts on what's going on around her. But there are a few very good exceptions to this, where she's able to stand on her own. The ending of episode 8, titled in English as I Was So Stupid, is one of these. It is a fantastic episode, and the ending is up there with such moments as Rebellion's epilogue and the entirety of episode 10. Taking place immediately after episode 7's mesmerizing fight against Elsa Maria, this episode and its ending break down Sayaka to her lowest point, and it's in this darkness that she shines brighter than ever before. So sit back, listen, and enjoy as I talk about what it means to reach the journey's end and how Sayaka's story comes to a terrifying but beautiful close. Leading up to her transformation into a witch, Sayaka has been going through a self-destructive cycle. First being at odds with Kyoko, Sayaka blindly follows Mami's lessons despite the end that she met. After learning the truth about soul gems and that she was basically no longer human, her whole outlook on life changes drastically. In the middle of all of this, Sayaka very suddenly finds herself in a one-sided conflict against her friend Hitomi, when the latter approaches the former talking about Kyosuke, who is of course the sole reason behind Sayaka's decision to become a magical girl. Unbeknownst to Sayaka, Hitomi had also grown feelings for the boy and took the opportunity of him finally being able to leave hospital as a chance to confess her feelings to him. Hitomi's sudden announcement understandably catches Sayaka off guard, and once Hitomi gives her this ultimatum, she immediately begins to think the worst not only about herself, but Hitomi as well. It all comes crashing down when she and the others learn about the true nature of soul gems and their essentially lifeless bodies. She no longer cares about herself, something which is further amplified by what she took as Hitomi betraying her, and her status as, in her own words, a zombie. Using her healing factor as an excuse, she fights and lives far more aggressively than ever, more dangerously than ever. From here you know the story. She refuses help from everybody, even Madoka, driving her and everyone away as she continues to destroy herself. In the scene prior, Sayaka, already starting her fall into despair, lets loose all of the rage and other raw emotions that she'd been suppressing for all of this time. The two men and anyone else unfortunate enough to be on board the same train lose their lives that night, at the hands of the one who swore to protect them. The protector had become the predator, the hero turned villain. By the time Kyoko meets her, it's already too late. Sayaka's soul gem is corrupted to such a point, the likes of which we had never seen before. There's nothing she can do now but accept the inevitable. Sayaka has a monologue about how, in hindsight, she realizes that the people she was pushing away really were just trying to help her, but it's a lesson that comes too late. She laments about how her wish really was a waste, and by this point, she didn't even really remember why she'd made it, be it for Kyosuke or herself. As she finally comes to accept her flaws and issues, this is when her soul gem shatters and she becomes the witch Octavia. It's cruel, but also fitting with how her character's arc had been up until this point. Just when she finally gets on good terms with herself is when she gets put down even further. Sayaka is, in my opinion, the most tragic character in the series. Homino certainly has an emotional and gripping story, and Kyoko's past is downright scary to imagine. But the thing that makes Sayaka's struggle and eventual downfall feel just that little bit more tragic is that her problems are so real and arguably most relatable. Now sure, this is an objective statement, but I think her story of wanting acceptance and failing to achieve it speaks to a lot of people. When I say acceptance, I don't just mean acceptance from others, because self-acceptance is just as, if not more important to a lot of people, and this could be the core of Sayaka's issues. Her struggle to accept herself, assuming the worst about herself and how people perceive her, clouded her views on everything. After becoming a magical girl, Sayaka immediately starts her dark descent to her eventual transformation into a witch, and it gets reflected in just how she acts, slightly colder with each episode following it. As I rewatched the series recently, I started to notice something specific about the way Sayaka acts, and I don't think I've ever seen people talk about it before. I believe Sayaka shares symptoms commonly associated with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. Of course, I claim to be no expert on the matter. I'm just using readily available information about OCPD and sharing the traits which I believe Sayaka has. A lot of these symptoms emerged almost immediately after she became a magical girl, but one which was there the whole time is Sayaka and her difficulty to share her feelings. More specifically, she has difficulty when it comes to Kyosuke. It's the driving force behind the second half of the series, and her difficulty to open up is what lets Hitomi express her feelings to the boy first. But we can't forget it's been there since the beginning. Her wish being for Kyosuke was, in a way, an easy way of her expressing feelings for him, in the hopes of him returning said feelings. Another major symptom you might see is that a person with OCPD could be hardworking, but inefficient due to an obsession with the idea of perfection. This, for Sayaka, is fairly self-explanatory, as she is fighting in an attempt to keep Mami's code of justice alive in Mitakihara City. This evolves into such a rigid adherence to her and Mami's moral codes that it results in her damaging herself. She fights familiars, which don't drop the grief seeds necessary for her soul gem to be restored, and even when she does fight witches, she refuses to use the grief seeds that they drop. After perceiving to have lost Kyosuke to Hitomi, she draws herself away from everyone else, and this leads to her social self-isolation. This, in turn, causes her anxiety to get worse as she grapples with the weight of the reveal of the truth behind magical girls, which was the last thing needed to force her deeper into this depressive state. Because of her isolation and because she pushed her friends away, she never got the help she needed, and it left her vulnerable. Despite her best efforts to keep going and the efforts of her friends, Sayaka was locked in a battle against her own broken mind. She wanted to do the right thing, follow in her mentor's footsteps, and be a hero for her city. But in the end, she met a fate more tragic than the others, because it could have all been avoided. Mami never led the perfect life. This is something that we and Madoka learn. However, Sayaka never learned this truth about Mami, and it's my opinion that she would have gone on a very different path if she had heard the same open confession from Mami as Madoka did in Charlotte's Labyrinth. Perhaps the saddest part about the scene is just how calm Sayaka is when she accepts her death. It's interesting to me that Kyoko is used in this scene, besides the obvious reasons of what the story presented. In the different story, which we discussed in the past episode, Kyoko is similarly just as calm as she turns away from Mami. The fact that Sayaka is so calm here shows that, well, obviously she's finally made peace with herself and her situation. And if you strip away all the magical girl stuff and keep everything else, this very quickly becomes obvious just how suicidal she'd become. This loops back to my opinion that Sayaka's story feels more widely relatable than the others. Again, this is obviously a subjective observation, and I will openly admit that this is because I feel that I personally relate to the very basics of Sayaka's story a lot. If we frame Sayaka's journey as one that ends in her taking her own life, a lot of the other outside factors become more apparent. Kyoko and Madoka's attempts to interfere are tragic to watch because, of course, they can see Sayaka is destroying herself. This happens a lot in real life too. If someone is suicidal and it's obvious to the people around them, it can be hard for both parties, especially when it seems like there's nothing that can happen, nothing that you can do to help. Sayaka doesn't want to be seen as weak, and she expresses this in the way she fights. She fights aggressively, and most of the time, she fights on her own. She doesn't want to rely on anyone because she just went through what she saw as a betrayal. Now she might be pushing Madoka away out of fear that she'll be like Hitomi. She ignores Kyoko because she doesn't want to admit to being weak and needing help, especially from someone that she didn't know prior. Sayaka's self-destruction is the biggest factor in her downfall. The worst part of this is that Sayaka, past a certain point, simply couldn't be saved anymore. What's just as hard to watch unfold as the journey itself is what comes after it. Aside from just her depression and isolation, Sayaka's story has the underlying theme of guilt. To start with, Sayaka herself expresses guilt on multiple occasions. "Maybe we're just blissfully ignorant fools," is a quote from Sayaka when realizing that she and Madoka have no reason to benefit from a wish by Kyubey, something made more obvious by the death of Mami. There is guilt in her words here because she knows that if she just uses the opportunity for herself now, someone else that needs it more doesn't get that chance. There's a guilt that hangs with her almost immediately after making her contract, in that she didn't just do it sooner. Since she knew that she was going to make the wish anyway, the fact that she didn't when Mami needed help weighs on her mind and probably contributes the most to her need to follow Mami's example as a magical girl. In the real world, Sayaka is presumed to have just taken her own life, news that shatters the world of everyone outside of the initial conflict regarding magical girls. Madoka and Kyoko now both live with guilt. Guilt because they know what truly happened, and they're unable to ever explain it to the very people who deserve to know the truth. Not only did Sayaka's family lose their daughter, but on top of this, they don't even get the closure of knowing what actually happened. It was all so sudden, came out of essentially nowhere for them. We don't know if Sayaka opened up to them. It's likely she didn't, but even then the true extent of her issues was probably too much on the outside to understand. One of the most striking and underrated scenes in the series is when Miss Saotome talks with Junko after Sayaka's funeral. While I won't go deep into it here, the scene talks about their guilt as adults for not noticing the signs of Sayaka's downfall sooner. This scene is really interesting to me as it shows a side of these characters that we just wouldn't see otherwise. And like I said, despite me not going into detail about it here, I appreciate that the show took this time to explore these characters in the way it did. So, in conclusion, I believe Sayaka to be the most tragic character in the series, and her story hits harder because of how widely relatable it is. Online discussion about her has sometimes prompted the idea that she, quote, deserved what came to her, but I obviously don't agree with this. Sayaka couldn't help what happened to her. She couldn't change how she felt about Kyosuke, nor could she help how she'd react when Hitomi approached her. I also need to say here that Hitomi is not really at fault either, in my opinion. I think we're meant to see Hitomi as an antagonist, so to speak, in this part of the story because the story we see plays out from Sayaka's point of view. Of course, it comes out of nowhere for Sayaka. She never saw Hitomi visit Kyosuke, but that doesn't mean that she never went. Sayaka is a biased narrator, and we only ever see her side of many of these conflicts as they play out, only learning more about them after the fact. What Sayaka brings to the series is what I think deserves the most praise. She simply has the most complete journey thus far, and really is the only one whose journey was completed. Hamada is still searching for her purpose and means of fulfilling her wish. Mami's life was tragically cut short, and Madoka is still being whisked into a destiny-fulfilling prophecy, giving her no peace or comfort. Sayaka is all but alone in the story in this sense, until, of course, you look at the only other character whose story had the chance to be completed. Kyoko. This is why I think Kyoko is the one to try and stop Sayaka as much as she did. It didn't come out of nowhere. She is the direct parallel to Sayaka, even down to their deaths, where Sayaka's comes to her at a point where she can no longer control the outcome. Kyoko's death is by her own hand, performing the sacrifice Sayaka always wanted to. She is simply the perfect foil for Sayaka, but this is a realization that, like everything else at this point, comes too late. Thank you for watching this fourth installment of the One Magical Moment series. This video was by far my most anticipated one. I had been working on an analysis about Sayaka for the longest time, and this series was the perfect opportunity to do so. This video was made possible with the help of my collaborator and proofreader for this project, Miriam. She was a great help in narrowing down the intricacies of Sayaka's OCPD symptoms and clarifying ideas that I had. So thank you very much for your help. You can find a link to her Twitter account in the description of this video. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and share the video with others who you think would enjoy it. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for next time when we finally tackle the series protagonist herself, Madoka.